Psalm 41, God lifts you up. Every secret enemy falls by his hand. In every generation, the people of God have walked through moments in which opposition rose silently around them. Not all enemies reveal themselves openly. Some operate in the shadows, behind conversations, behind closed doors, behind smiles that do not match the heart. Psalm 41 speaks directly to this ancient and enduring reality. The existence of hidden adversaries, secret intentions, quiet betrayals, and the unseen spiritual pressures that come against those whom God has chosen, anointed, or appointed for a higher purpose. Yet the psalm does not leave the faithful in despair. It reveals a God who observes all things, intervenes with justice, lifts up the one who is bowed down, and overturns every plot designed to bring harm. To meditate deeply on Psalm 41 is to understand both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit when it is anchored in God. David, the psalmist, expresses the pain of betrayal from those he trusted, the weight of sickness, the heaviness of spiritual attack, and the loneliness that surrounds a soul when opposition multiplies. But within that same psalm lies the resounding declaration of God's faithfulness, his unwavering capacity to defend, restore, and vindicate his servant. What begins as lament becomes prophecy. What begins as weakness becomes revelation. What begins as danger becomes a testimony of divine rescue. This text will explore Psalm 41 at a depth rarely approached, moving through the layers of spiritual meaning that surround betrayal, adversity, hidden enemies, and the righteous deliverance of God. It will not merely explain the psalm, but expand its spiritual implications for those who fight invisible battles, withstand silent judgments, or carry wounds caused by the betrayal of intimacy. We will see how God responds to injustice, how he lifts the humble, how he confronts hidden schemes, and how he restores strength to those who are targeted by spiritual and earthly adversaries. The journey through these 5 topics will be long, profound, and continuous, offering thousands of words of reflection designed for deep spiritual nourishment, understanding, and empowerment. Each section will unfold the mystery of God's intervention in the life of the individual who has been pushed down, isolated, attacked, spoken against, misunderstood, or wounded by those who walked close enough to know where to strike. You will see how God stands as the final witness, judge, protector, and vindicator of every soul that belongs to him. Let us begin with the first great theme, the weight of hidden enemies and the divine attention that rests upon the afflicted. God sees the hidden enemies and lifts the faithful from silent battles. There are battles in life that are visible, loud, and unmistakable. They manifest through open conflict, declared opposition, and enemies who proclaim their hostility. But there is another kind of battle that is far more insidious, far more painful, and far more spiritually complex, the battle against secret enemies. These are individuals who walk close, but whose hearts drift far, whose mouths speak peace while their intentions cultivate harm, whose presence seems friendly, but whose spirit aligns with destruction. Psalm 41 begins by acknowledging that the righteous are not exempt from these experiences. In fact, those who carry divine purpose, spiritual assignment, or a calling on their life often attract hidden adversaries precisely because the enemy recognizes the potential inside them. Hidden enemies operate through subtlety. They do not strike immediately, nor do they reveal their true motives. Instead, they observe, wait, calculate, and speak with double meanings. They cloak their intentions with politeness or spiritual language, but the vibration of their presence carries dissonance. God, however, sees what humans cannot. Long before a hidden enemy unveils themselves, God has already discerned the thoughts, motives, and strategies within their heart. This is why Psalm 41 opens by blessing the one who considers the poor or afflicted, for such a person draws the compassionate eye of God. The world may overlook their suffering, but heaven takes note. In the realm of spiritual warfare, one of the greatest torments is the feeling of being misunderstood or unfairly targeted by those who have no just cause. The heart becomes heavy under the pressure of accusations, rumors, misinterpretations, or judgments that rise without reason. Words spoken behind one's back can produce wounds sharper than a physical blade. David experienced this deeply. He writes in Psalm 41 of individuals who whispered together, plotting his downfall, predicting his demise, and believing that he would never rise again. These whispers represent more than gossip. They reveal the spiritual hostility that surrounds a chosen individual. Every chosen person will eventually encounter this type of opposition because spiritual assignment always provokes spiritual resistance. You cannot carry light without attracting darkness. You cannot walk in truth without provoking deception. You cannot grow in favor without stirring jealousy. And you cannot rise in destiny without awakening adversaries. Many people believe that enemies appear because they have done something wrong, but often the opposite is true. Enemies appear because you are doing something right. The presence of hidden hostility is frequently the evidence of divine elevation. But even when surrounded by concealed opposition, the faithful do not suffer alone. God leans toward those who suffer injustice. He bends his ear toward the cry of the afflicted. He hears what was spoken in secret. He discerns what others attempt to hide. Nothing escapes his awareness. Not a whispered insult, not a concealed plot, not a silent wish for your downfall, not a quiet agreement against your life. God's justice is perfect because it is rooted in complete knowledge. Humans judge based on what they see, but God judges based on what he knows. David writes that his enemies spoke evil against him, saying that a deadly thing had fastened itself to him and that he would never rise again. This statement reveals a profound truth. Hidden enemies often attack in moments of vulnerability. When you are weakened emotionally, physically, or spiritually, that is when your adversaries gain the courage to strike. They assume your condition will finish you. They assume you cannot recover. They assume your current state predicts your future state. They assume God has abandoned you, but God delights in overturning assumptions. Just as hidden enemies planned David's downfall, they also misread the heart of God. They failed to understand that divine protection intensifies around the wounded. When a believer is fragile, heaven becomes fierce. When a soul cries, angels move. When the righteous are pushed down, the hand of God reaches out with greater strength. What hidden enemies interpret as defeat, God interprets as preparation for elevation. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly demonstrates a pattern. He allows his servants to enter moments of great vulnerability, not to destroy them, but to reveal his power, expose the hearts of adversaries, and establish a testimony that cannot be denied. When Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, God witnessed every moment. When Daniel was targeted by jealous officials who conspired to have him thrown into a den of lions, God watched the plot long before it unfolded. When Esther faced the genocidal scheme of Haman, the hidden enemy operated behind political influence and personal ego, but God intervened at the perfect moment. When Jesus was betrayed by Judas, the ultimate hidden enemy, God already knew the heart of the betrayer. God does not react to hidden enemies, he preempts them. Many people question why God allows betrayal or false accusations to occur. If God sees everything, why not stop it? The answer is that hidden enemies reveal hidden truths. The truth about your strength, the truth about your faith, the truth about your destiny, the truth about the character of those around you, and most importantly, the truth about God's power to turn harm into blessing. Without hidden enemies, you would never discover hidden strength. Without betrayal, you would never uncover the loyalty of God. Without spiritual attack, you would never experience spiritual victory. Psalm 41 teaches that God not only sees secret enemies, but also intervenes decisively on behalf of the faithful. David declares that God sustains him on his sickbed and restores him from illness. This restoration is both physical and symbolic. God restores the body, the mind, the reputation, the influence, the dignity, the position, and the spiritual authority of the one who has been afflicted. What enemies thought would weaken you becomes the place where God strengthens you. What they assumed would destroy you becomes the catalyst for divine elevation. One of the most significant lines in Psalm 41 is when David acknowledges that his close friend, someone who shared his bread, lifted up his heel against him. This is not just a description of betrayal, it is a prophetic revelation of the Messiah's own experience. Jesus quotes this verse in John 13:18 to explain Judas's betrayal. This means that Psalm 41 contains layers of meaning that stretch across time. It speaks to David's experience, to Christ's suffering, and to the personal trials of believers today. To be targeted by a close friend is one of the deepest pains a soul can endure. Betrayal from strangers is manageable, but betrayal from someone within your inner circle carries a unique sting. It creates a spiritual shock. It disrupts trust. It creates emotional disorientation. But even this pain, as Psalm 41 reveals, is seen by God and used for a higher purpose. Judas believed he was eliminating Jesus, but his actions ultimately fulfilled a redemptive plan that would save billions. Hidden enemies think they are removing you, but God uses their actions to reposition you. The biblical pattern is unmistakable. Betrayal precedes promotion. Every time a servant of God experiences a deep injustice or quiet attack, it is often the final stage before divine elevation. The enemy senses the shift before you do. They perceive your impending rise and react with hostility. Just as storms intensify before a breakthrough, hidden enemies often grow louder, bolder, or more active before God lifts you into a new season. God does not waste the pain inflicted by secret adversaries. He uses it to increase your discernment, sharpen your wisdom, strengthen your faith, reorder your relationships, and elevate your spiritual authority. Those who betray you become instruments in the hands of God, not for your destruction, but for your transformation. David concludes the psalm by proclaiming that God upholds him because of his integrity and sets him in his presence forever. This statement reveals the final victory of the faithful. God himself becomes their vindication. No rumor can outlast divine truth. No betrayal can outrank divine judgment. No human plot can override God's plan. And no hidden enemy can prevent the rise of someone whom God has chosen to lift up. This is the mystery of Psalm 41. The enemies you cannot see are seen by the God who cannot be deceived. Their words are heard by the God who cannot be misled. Their intentions are exposed before the God who cannot be manipulated, and their actions are limited by the God who cannot be defeated. Therefore, if you are facing secret opposition, silent hostility, or hidden betrayal, know this: you are not alone. God is not silent. He is not distant. He is not passive. He is actively watching, judging, discerning, and preparing your deliverance. The very existence of hidden enemies is proof that you carry divine purpose, and the fact that God has revealed their presence to you is evidence that He is preparing to lift you up. When God lifts you, no enemy, hidden or visible, can pull you down. When God restores you, no accusation can stain you. When God defends you, no weapon can prevail. When God speaks for you, every voice that rose against you becomes silent. This is the promise of Psalm 41. God lifts you up, and every secret enemy falls by His hand. Please subscribe to the channel to receive more teachings, reflections, and deep spiritual messages that strengthen your walk with God. There are seasons in the life of every believer when the weight of adversity becomes so heavy that the soul begins to question whether it will ever rise again. These are the moments when darkness surrounds not because of open warfare, but because of pressure that builds quietly, subtly, persistently. Sometimes it is the accumulation of many small wounds that makes the heart weary. Sometimes it is a single devastating betrayal that shakes the foundation of one's confidence. Sometimes it is the silence of others when support was expected. And sometimes it is the inner exhaustion of fighting battles few people understand or even acknowledge. Psalm 41 speaks into this reality with divine clarity because it reveals that God's deliverance is not a distant hope, but an active process unfolding even in the midst of suffering. The second great movement of this psalm is the revelation that God not only sees the afflicted, but lifts them up in ways that overturn the verdicts spoken by enemies, whether visible or hidden. When David cried out in distress, he was not merely asking God to observe his pain, he was appealing to the character of God as a restorer. For restoration is not simply the reversal of suffering, it is the elevation of a person into a place stronger, wiser, purer, and more aligned with divine purpose than before the suffering began. This theme resonates throughout Scripture because restoration is one of God's signature works. It is how he rescues his people from shame, how he breaks the plans of the enemy, and how he reveals his glory through the lives of those who trust him. David's words in Psalm 41 echo the deep cry of a soul surrounded by hostility, weakened in body, wounded in heart, yet still anchored in faith that God would raise him up. The raising up of the righteous is not symbolic. It is a spiritual pattern that occurs whenever God's favor collides with human adversity. To understand the full depth of this restoration, it is necessary to explore the inner landscape of a believer who is suffering under the weight of betrayal or secret hostility. There is a loneliness that follows betrayal that few can describe. It is not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of realizing that someone who held access to your life misused that access to wound you. Trust becomes fractured. Confidence becomes fragile. Even one's sense of spiritual direction can feel blurred. Hidden enemies often attempt to shape the narrative of your life through their words and assumptions. They assume they know your weaknesses, your limitations, and your breaking point. They assume that their betrayal or judgment will define your future. They assume that your wounds will silence your calling. But what they fail to understand is that God himself intervenes when his servants are pushed to the edge. God draws closest to the wounded, not to pity them, but to raise them. David writes that his enemies whispered against him, saying that he would never rise again. This is the language of defeat, spoken by those who believe they have gained an advantage. They see the afflicted in weakness and conclude that weakness is permanent. Humans often misinterpret suffering as the end, but God sees suffering as the soil in which resurrection power begins to grow. The whispers of enemies, no matter how numerous, cannot override the word that God has spoken over a person's life. If God has ordained elevation, no amount of opposition can erase it. If God has decreed restoration, no betrayal can cancel it. If God has appointed someone for purpose, no hidden enemy can alter that destiny. One of the profound realities of Psalm 41 is that David is not only fighting external opposition, he is also navigating internal turmoil. The human heart is deeply affected by the wounds caused by those we trust. Pain has a way of echoing internally long after the external event has passed. Thoughts replay, questions arise, doubt grows. Yet even in this emotional turbulence, David turns his gaze toward God. He recognizes that restoration comes not from human vindication, but from divine intervention. Human beings may debate your character, question your motives, or speculate about your future, but God alone knows the truth. And when God decides to lift someone, he does so in a manner that silences every voice raised against them. The lifting of God is not always immediate, but it is always intentional. Delay does not mean denial, it means development. God allows certain trials not to harm the believer, but to refine their heart, sharpen their discernment, and strengthen their dependence on Him. Before elevation comes purification. Before restoration comes revelation. Before breakthrough comes inner transformation. In the quiet hours of pain, God works in the depths of the soul. He confronts fears. He exposes motives. He deepens trust. He separates the believer from reliance on human affirmation. He teaches them to stand, not on the fragile foundation of human approval, but on the unshakable truth of His promises. It is precisely when enemies believe they have won that God begins the work of lifting His servant. Hidden enemies misread silence as weakness. They misinterpret vulnerability as defeat. They do not realize that God is repositioning the afflicted into a place that transcends human strategies. Divine elevation is not a return to the previous level. It is an ascent to a place the enemy cannot reach. When God lifts you, He lifts you above the reach of those who tried to harm you. He lifts you above their words, above their assumptions, above their judgments, above their reach. The higher God lifts you, the smaller your enemies become. Restoration in Psalm 41 is not merely emotional or spiritual, it is comprehensive. God restores strength to the body, dignity to the reputation, clarity to the mind, stability to the spirit, and honor to the life of the faithful. He takes what was used against you and transforms it into a testimony. The betrayal that once broke you becomes the doorway to greater wisdom. The hostility that once threatened you becomes the catalyst for deeper intimacy with God. The weakness that once frightened you becomes the stage on which God displays His power. In this way, restoration becomes a revelation of God's character, for only He can take what was meant for evil and turn it into a source of blessing. David's experience in Psalm 41 reflects a universal truth. The deeper the wound, the greater the restoration. The enemy aims to break you, but God aims to rebuild you with greater strength. The enemy aims to silence you, but God aims to amplify your voice. The enemy aims to isolate you, but God aims to draw you into deeper communion with Himself. Every attempt of the enemy becomes an opportunity for God to demonstrate His sovereignty. This is why believers must never interpret suffering as abandonment. The presence of adversity is often the clearest sign of future elevation. The spiritual reality beneath Psalm 41 is that God rescues the righteous not only from external danger, but from internal collapse. When the heart is exhausted, God becomes its strength. When the mind is overwhelmed, God becomes its clarity. When the body is frail, God becomes its restorer. When relationships fracture, God becomes its refuge. When trust is shattered, God becomes its foundation. This is why David, despite his anguish, continues to cry out to God. His hope is not in people, not in circumstances, not in physical strength, but in the God who lifts the fallen. The lifting of God is intimate, personal, and powerful. It is not done from afar. God does not shout instructions from the heavens. He draws near to the suffering soul and raises it with His own hand. The lifting may take place slowly or suddenly, visibly or invisibly, but it is always certain. And when God lifts you, He does so in a way that exposes the emptiness of every accusation spoken against you. He brings truth to the surface. He reveals what was hidden. He exposes motives. He vindicates your integrity. He restores what was lost, and He multiplies what remains. Hidden enemies often underestimate the resilience of a believer who is upheld by God. They forget that divine strength is not measured by human standards. They forget that spiritual endurance is not sustained by human willpower, but by divine sustenance. They forget that a person walking under God's protection carries authority that cannot be broken by human schemes. David understood this deeply. Though weakened, he was not destroyed. Though betrayed, he was not abandoned. Though attacked, he was not defeated. The presence of God preserved him. This preservation is one of the most profound aspects of God's care. He does not merely restore after the battle, he sustains during the battle. He does not simply heal after the attack. He shields during the attack. He does not wait for the storm to end. He stands with the believer in the center of it. Those who trust God discover that his protection is not theoretical but experiential. They see the evidence of his hand in moments when they should have fallen but remained standing. They recognize his intervention in moments when circumstances should have overwhelmed them but did not. They feel his presence in moments when silence should have crushed them but instead became sacred ground. The work of restoration in Psalm 41 also includes a reversal of expectations. Enemies expect the afflicted to fall permanently, but God causes the faithful to rise again. Enemies expect the afflicted to lose favor, but God increases their favor. Enemies expect the afflicted to lose influence, but God expands their influence. Enemies expect the afflicted to withdraw, but God pushes them forward. Every prediction made by hidden enemies becomes evidence of their limited understanding, for they interpret life without divine revelation. They see the moment, but not the future. They see the struggle, but not the purpose. They see the pain, but not the promise. God, however, sees everything from beginning to end. He orchestrates restoration not based on human timing, but on divine wisdom. The lifting of God always occurs at the precise moment when its impact will be greatest. He restores not merely to comfort the believer, but to reveal his glory. The testimony of restoration impacts not only the individual, but also all who witness their rise. Those who doubted become silent. Those who opposed become powerless. Those who judged become irrelevant. And those who believed become strengthened. It is essential to understand that God's lifting does not validate every decision of the believer, but honors the integrity of their heart. David was not perfect, yet God upheld him because of his sincerity. God responds to authenticity, humility, and dependence. He lifts those who acknowledge their need for him. He restores those who confess their weakness. He honors those who refuse to retaliate with their own strength, but surrender the battle to him. The measure of divine lifting is determined not by human achievement, but by the posture of the heart. When God lifts a person, he does so permanently. Human promotion can be revoked, but divine elevation cannot. Human approval can fade, but divine favor endures. Human platforms can collapse, but divine purpose stands firm. When God decides to lift you, no enemy can reverse it. No accusation can undo it. No betrayal can weaken it. No opposition can stop it. When God lifts, he establishes, and when he establishes, he protects. This is the assurance that Psalm 41 gives to every believer who is walking through pain, adversity, betrayal, or misunderstanding. The God who sees your tears also plans your rising. The God who hears your cries also prepares your victory. The God who witnesses your suffering also orchestrates your restoration. Nothing escapes his notice. Nothing exceeds his control. Nothing interrupts his purpose. Not hidden enemies, not sickness, not weakness, not betrayal, not fear, not uncertainty. God lifts the faithful because his name is at stake in their lives. He has tied his reputation to his covenant with his people. When enemies rise against a believer, they are not merely attacking a person, they are attacking someone who carries the mark of God's presence. And God will never allow his name to be dishonored by the triumph of the wicked. He lifts the righteous not only for their sake, but for the sake of his glory. This means that your restoration is certain not only because God loves you, but because God is faithful to himself. As you meditate on Psalm 41, allow this truth to saturate your heart. God is already lifting you, even if you cannot yet see the evidence. He is healing what was wounded. He is reversing what was spoken. He is exposing what was hidden. He is strengthening what was weakened. He is preparing a future that outshines your past. The valley is temporary. The affliction is temporary. The betrayal is temporary. But the restoration of God is eternal. And when he lifts you, you will rise not as the person you were before the suffering, but as someone transformed, purified, strengthened, and prepared for a greater purpose than you imagined. Your rising will testify of God's intervention. Your restoration will silence your enemies. Your elevation will reveal his glory. This is the promise and the power of Psalm 41. Please subscribe to the channel to continue receiving messages like this that strengthen your spirit and deepen your understanding of God's work in your life. There are moments in the spiritual life when the weight of opposition becomes so intense and the silence of God so profound that the believer begins to wonder whether divine justice will truly manifest. The human heart longs for resolution, for vindication, for clarity, for the moment when the truth finally rises above the accusations, misunderstandings, and judgments that surround it. Psalm 41 enters deeply into this longing, revealing that God not only restores the afflicted, but also executes justice upon the schemes of hidden enemies. The justice of God is not like the justice of humans. Human justice is limited by perception, influenced by emotion, and bound by incomplete knowledge. But divine justice is rooted in perfect understanding, total awareness, and unchanging righteousness. This is why David, surrounded by enemies who desired his downfall, turned not to people for vindication, but to God alone. The desire for vindication is not rooted in pride, but in the longing for truth. Every soul desires to be seen accurately, understood correctly, and judged fairly, but the world rarely grants this. People form conclusions without knowledge. They interpret your silence, your suffering, your decisions, or your struggles without insight into your heart. Hidden enemies take advantage of moments of weakness to build narratives that remain far from truth. They whisper assumptions, spread interpretations, and plant seeds of doubt. Yet even while they do so, God watches. He is not passive. He does not ignore the injustice. He does not abandon the wounded. In the economy of heaven, every word spoken in darkness will be answered by light. Every plot will be overturned. Every lie will be exposed. Every wound will be addressed. Divine justice begins not with punishment, but with revelation. Before God acts against an enemy, he reveals the truth about the situation. He exposes motives. He brings hidden conversations into the light. He exposes intentions wrapped in false kindness. He reveals the difference between genuine concern and concealed hostility. Every hidden enemy eventually exposes themselves, not because the believer discovers them, but because God orchestrates their unveiling. The more an enemy schemes, the more God permits their intentions to reveal their character. Hidden enemies believe they are manipulating circumstances, but in reality, they are fulfilling divine prophecy. Their words and actions become evidence used by God to justify his intervention on behalf of the righteous. The justice of God includes timing. Human beings desire immediate justice, but divine justice operates according to perfect timing. God waits until the moment when the revelation of truth will have the greatest impact. If he exposes too early, the believer may not yet be ready to rise. If he exposes too late, the damage may exceed the purpose of the test. But God knows exactly when to act. The longer he waits, the more complete the vindication becomes. When God reveals the truth, there is no argument left to make, no interpretation left to defend, no accusation left to stand. His justice is final, complete, and undeniable. There is a spiritual law that governs the life of every believer. The one who digs a pit for the righteous falls into it himself. This principle is repeated throughout Scripture. Haman built a gallows for Mordecai, but was hanged on it himself. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, intending harm, but God used their actions to elevate Joseph to a position in which he would save them from famine. Daniel's enemies conspired to destroy him, but they themselves were devoured by the lions. Pharaoh plotted to destroy the Israelites, but his own army drowned in the sea. The justice of God is not merely the defeat of enemies, but the reversal of their intentions. What they designed to harm you becomes the very instrument of their own downfall. When God intervenes, the schemes of the wicked collapse under the weight of their own deception. David understood this deeply. His prayer in Psalm 41 is not simply for restoration, but for victory over those who sought his downfall. He does not ask God to ignore their behavior. He asks God to confront it. The reason is clear. For justice to be complete, restoration must be accompanied by the defeat of injustice. If God restored David without addressing the schemes of his enemies, the enemies would simply repeat their behavior. But when God reveals their motives and brings them to nothing, the cycle of attack is broken. Hidden enemies thrive in darkness, but when exposed by God, they lose their power. It is important to understand that divine justice does not require the believer to retaliate or defend themselves. David did not seek vengeance. Instead, he surrendered his case to God. This is the essence of spiritual maturity, trusting that God will do what you cannot do for yourself. The believer must resist the temptation to respond to enemies with the same hostility they receive. Retaliation may offer temporary satisfaction, but it interrupts the work of divine justice. When a believer fights their own battles, God steps back. But when a believer remains silent, God steps in. Silence is not weakness, it is trust. It is the refusal to descend to the level of those who harm you. It is the recognition that justice belongs not to the afflicted, but to the righteous judge. The silence of divine justice is one of its most mysterious aspects. God often appears silent during seasons of betrayal or attack. This silence is not abandonment, but observation. God allows enemies to reveal their full intentions so that his justice will be complete. If he acted at the first sign of betrayal, motives would remain concealed. But when he waits, the truth becomes undeniable. Every word spoken against you, every plot formed in secret, every action designed to diminish your life becomes part of the record that God uses to justify your vindication. When he finally moves, he leaves no doubt that the victory belongs to him. The justice of God is also tied to his mercy. He corrects the righteous while confronting the wicked. For the believer, affliction becomes purification. For the enemy, affliction becomes judgment. This dual purpose explains why God permits trials. If he prevented every attack, the believer would never be refined. If he allowed every attack to succeed, the believer would be destroyed. Instead, he allows just enough pressure to purify, but not enough to break. This balance is divine wisdom. Every believer must walk through this tension. While enemies plot, God purifies. While enemies attempt to destroy, God strengthens. While enemies accuse, God justifies. What the enemy intends for destruction becomes the instrument of transformation. There are believers who have endured years of misjudgment, suspicion, slander, or silent hostility. They carry wounds that have shaped their personalities, their decisions, their relationships, their fears, and their expectations. Yet even in the deepest wounds, there remains a quiet truth. God has seen every tear. The human soul may forget its own resilience, but God remembers. The believer may doubt their own strength, but God upholds them. The wounds inflicted by hidden enemies do not define the believer's destiny. They reveal the magnitude of their calling. The enemy attacks where he perceives divine potential. He seeks to destroy destiny before it manifests. He attempts to suffocate identity before it fully awakens. But God uses every attack as a signal that promotion is near. In the mystery of divine justice, God sometimes permits the enemy to rise temporarily so that their fall will be visible. If enemies never gained influence, their collapse would go unnoticed. If their words never carried weight, their exposure would lack significance. So God allows them to advance just enough that their defeat becomes undeniable. When Haman rose to power, God allowed him to believe he was unstoppable. When Judas walked with Jesus, God allowed him to act freely. When Joseph's brothers conspired, God allowed them to carry out their plan. In each case, divine justice did not prevent the plot, but reversed the outcome. The rise of an enemy is often a sign that their defeat will reveal the glory of God. Justice does not merely punish wrongdoing, it restores balance. It reorders what was disordered, repairs what was broken, reverses what was damaged, and reestablishes what was stolen. The justice of God is restoration in motion. It is not static, but active. It moves through circumstances, relationships, minds, and hearts. It brings clarity where confusion reigned. It brings truth where deception thrived. It brings honor where shame was imposed. It brings elevation where demotion was engineered. This is why David concludes Psalm 41 with a declaration of confidence in God's justice. He knows that the God who lifts him will also deal with those who sought to destroy him. There is a unique strength that emerges in the believer who has witnessed divine justice firsthand. This strength is not born from victory, but from survival. It is the strength of someone who has endured the whispers of enemies, yet refused to break. It is the strength of someone who has walked through betrayal, yet preserved their integrity. It is the strength of someone who has suffered silently, yet continued to trust God. This strength cannot be taught. It can only be developed in the presence of adversity. It is the strength of someone who has been held by God in the darkest hour. When God lifts them, their rise carries a depth that no enemy can touch. Another dimension of divine justice is the protection of the believer's destiny. God will not allow hidden enemies to sabotage what he has ordained. They may delay, but they cannot destroy. They may wound, but they cannot stop. They may confuse, but they cannot rewrite what God has written. Every destiny carries protection, even when the believer does not feel it. Angels are assigned, doors are guarded, opportunities are shielded. Without this protection, no believer would survive the schemes of the enemy. But God surrounds his people with armor invisible to human eyes. Enemies may gather, but they cannot penetrate the perimeter of divine protection. Their strategies remain powerless until God permits them, and when he does, it is only for the benefit of the believer. Divine justice also transforms the heart of the believer. It removes bitterness, anger, resentment, and the desire for revenge. These emotions, if left unhealed, become cages that imprison the soul. But when the believer witnesses God's justice, the heart becomes free. It no longer carries the burden of proving itself. It no longer fights battles it was never meant to fight. It no longer seeks validation from those who misjudged it. It no longer clings to the wounds of betrayal. Instead, the believer gains clarity about their true identity. They recognize that their worth does not depend on human acceptance, but on divine approval. They understand that peace does not come from circumstances, but from surrender. They learn to release the past and embrace the future God has prepared. There is also a prophetic dimension to divine justice. When God vindicates a believer, he does so in a way that proclaims his sovereignty to all who witness it. The restoration becomes a message, the elevation becomes a sign, the transformation becomes a testimony, the believer becomes a living demonstration of God's power. Hidden enemies may attempt to erase your influence, But God turns your life into evidence of His intervention. Your survival becomes a declaration. Your resilience becomes a prophecy. Your rising becomes a revelation. Your victory becomes a reminder that God's justice cannot be stopped. In the deepest layers of spiritual experience, divine justice is not only an act of God, but an attribute of God. He cannot be unjust. He cannot overlook evil. He cannot ignore suffering. He cannot abandon the righteous. His character demands that He act. Even when He delays with purpose. Even when He is silent, He is working. Even when He seems distant, He is preparing. Justice is not something God occasionally performs. It is something He continually embodies. To trust God is to trust His timing, His methods, His purposes, and His outcomes. When God finally executes justice, it comes with clarity, completeness, and finality. There is no confusion about what happened. There is no uncertainty about who was right or wrong. There is no doubt about God's involvement. The believer rises with peace. The enemy falls with silence. The truth stands firm, and the glory belongs to God alone. This is the promise embedded in Psalm 41. The God who sees your suffering will not allow injustice to have the final word. He will lift you up. He will heal your wounds. He will restore your strength, and He will confront every hidden enemy who sought your downfall. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next message that strengthens your faith and deepens your walk with God. There comes a point in every spiritual journey when the believer must confront the profound mystery of how God preserves the soul in seasons of intense vulnerability. The human heart was not designed to endure betrayal, slander, isolation, or emotional exhaustion alone. Yet in the reality of life, these experiences come upon even the most faithful. Psalm 41 contains within it a sacred thread of revelation. God not only restores and vindicates His people, but sustains them in the very moments when they feel most fragile. This divine sustenance is not merely a gentle encouragement, but a supernatural strength that works beneath the surface, upholding the believer when every visible foundation seems to collapse. Understanding this dimension of God's work requires entering deeply into the tension between human frailty and divine power. The human soul is easily wounded. Words spoken in anger linger far longer than expected. Betrayal from a trusted friend leaves an imprint that years cannot easily erase. The whispers of enemies create emotional instability. The absence of support generates feelings of abandonment. Even physical illness carries spiritual weight, especially when combined with emotional pain. David experienced all these afflictions at once. Psalm 41 reveals a man whose body was weakened, whose reputation was under attack, whose friends had deserted him or turned against him, and whose enemies rejoiced in his suffering. This convergence of adversity would have been enough to break any ordinary person. Yet David remained unbroken, not because of personal strength, but because God Himself upheld him. The sustaining power of God is one of the least understood, yet most essential aspects of spiritual life. Many believers imagine God only in terms of rescue or intervention, but Scripture teaches that God sustains before He restores. Sustenance is the quiet miracle that occurs when the soul continues to stand, even though circumstances dictate it should have fallen. It is the invisible presence that steadies the heart when confusion should have overwhelmed it. It is the inexplicable peace that settles in the mind when chaos surrounds it. It is the internal resolve that awakens in a person who should have been spiritually exhausted. This is the sustaining power mentioned implicitly in Psalm 41, when David declares that God supports him on his sick bed and restores him from illness. To be sustained by God means to be preserved while still in the battle. Restoration takes place after the battle, but sustenance takes place during it. If restoration is God raising you up, sustenance is God holding you up. Many believers underestimate the magnitude of this divine support. They assume they are surviving because they are strong, disciplined, or resilient. But if the veil were lifted, they would see that spiritual forces have been assigned to guard them, that divine strength has been working in their weakness, and that God has surrounded their souls with invisible walls of protection. Without this sustenance, the believer would collapse under the weight of spiritual warfare long before restoration arrives. Sustaining grace is often quiet, almost imperceptible. God does not always declare his presence loudly. Sometimes he whispers strength into the heart. Sometimes he steadies the mind with a thought of hope. Sometimes he prevents despair from taking root. Sometimes he blocks the enemy's attack before the believer even perceives it. Sometimes he grants the strength to continue walking when every emotion urges retreat. The believer rarely realizes the full extent of God's sustaining power until after the storm has passed. Only then do they look back and say, "I should not have survived this, yet I did." That realization becomes one of the deepest forms of worship, for it is rooted in gratitude rather than triumph. In Psalm 41, David's suffering is not merely physical. It is emotional, relational, and spiritual. He is betrayed by a close friend, surrounded by enemies, weakened by illness, and burdened by the weight of accusation. This combination magnifies the need for divine sustenance. Human support was insufficient. Social reputation was tarnished. His body lacked strength. His heart lacked reassurance. Yet God upheld him. This is the essence of divine sustenance. When every earthly support fails, God remains. When human affection fades, God remains. When reputation collapses, God remains. When strength fails, God remains. When the soul trembles, God remains. The sustaining power of God reveals his compassion. God does not simply wait for the believer to fall so that he can lift them. Instead, he upholds them throughout the trial so that they can endure long enough to receive restoration. This compassion is not sentimental, it is fierce. God fights for the soul long before the soul realizes it is in danger. He guards thoughts, stabilizes emotions, strengthens resolve, and protects identity. He prevents the lies of the enemy from infiltrating the deepest parts of the heart. He shields the mind from internal collapse. This inner protection is often overlooked because it does not manifest externally, yet it is one of the greatest works of God in the human experience. Another extraordinary dimension of divine sustenance is its ability to preserve the believer's character during adversity. The human instinct is to become bitter, defensive, angry, or vengeful when attacked. Yet many believers find themselves responding to betrayal with unexpected grace, responding to hostility with dignity, responding to injustice with patience. This is not natural. It is evidence of God sustaining not only the soul, but the character. The believer remains faithful because God is faithful within them. They do not collapse morally or spiritually because God protects their integrity from corruption. The sustaining power of God is not simply physical or emotional, it is moral and spiritual as well. Many people misunderstand the nature of spiritual endurance. They believe endurance is something they produce through willpower. But divine endurance is not self-generated. It is given. It is supplied by God, often without the believer's awareness. It is the reason some people endure years of trials without becoming cynical. It is the reason some believers continue to love despite having been wounded repeatedly. It is the reason some people maintain hope in situations where others would have surrendered. It is the reason faith persists even when circumstances contradict it. Divine endurance is a supernatural empowerment that rests upon those whom God has chosen to carry a spiritual assignment. In the context of Psalm 41, the sustaining work of God is directly connected to divine purpose. David is not sustained merely because he is in pain. He is sustained because he carries destiny. The enemy attacks those with purpose. The greater the calling, the more intense the opposition. Hidden enemies do not waste energy on those who pose no spiritual threat. They target the one who carries the anointing, the one whose life influences others, the one whose testimony will strengthen generations, the one whose intimacy with God produces spiritual authority. David was attacked because he was chosen. The attacks were evidence of destiny, not abandonment. Similarly, when believers endure inexplicable hardships, betrayals, or spiritual battles, it is often because they carry something the enemy fears. Divine sustenance, therefore, becomes the protection of destiny. God sustains the believer not simply to ease their suffering, but to preserve their purpose. If the enemy could destroy the believer during their weakest moment, the entire trajectory of their calling would collapse. This is why God does not permit the enemy to strike beyond certain limits. Just as he set boundaries around Job, he sets boundaries around the life of every believer. The enemy may attack, but he cannot kill destiny. He may afflict, but he cannot erase purpose. He may wound, but he cannot dismantle calling. Divine sustenance acts as the shield that guards purpose until the believer reaches the next stage of divine assignment. One of the profound mysteries of spiritual life is that God's sustaining presence is often strongest when his visible activity seems weakest. People often interpret silence as absence, but in divine reality, silence often means protection. When God does not speak, he sustains. When he does not intervene visibly, he intervenes invisibly. When he does not remove the trial, he strengthens the believer within it. Silence is not neglect, it is preparation. Silence is not abandonment, it is formation. Silence is not distance, it is depth. For God often works most powerfully in the unseen realm, shaping the inner life of the believer in ways that external blessings could never accomplish. During seasons of quiet suffering, God accomplishes internal transformations that cannot occur in comfort. He refines motives. He purifies desires. He breaks unhealthy dependencies. He strengthens spiritual discernment. He teaches the believer how to walk by faith rather than by sight. He develops patience, humility, compassion, and resilience. These qualities are not born in times of ease, but in times of pressure. The soul expands under strain. Spiritual authority emerges through hardship. Wisdom deepens through adversity. The believer becomes someone capable of carrying divine responsibility. Sustenance is therefore not merely survival, it is transformation. The transformation produced by divine sustenance is not always immediately recognizable. It often appears gradually, subtly, quietly. The believer emerges from the trial with a different kind of strength, a strength that cannot be explained, a strength that is not rooted in personality but in divine partnership. They speak with greater clarity. They walk with deeper conviction. They discern motives with heightened sensitivity. They no longer fear the opinions of others. They do not fall apart under pressure. They are not easily manipulated by emotional or spiritual tactics. They have learned to draw strength from God alone. This transformation is the fruit of divine sustenance. Even more profound is the way God sustains the believer's identity during seasons of attack. Hidden enemies often attempt to redefine the believer through accusation, misinterpretation, or slander. They hope that psychological damage will weaken the sense of self. They speak words designed to create confusion about self-worth. They create narratives intended to shape public perception, but God protects identity. He guards the core of who the believer is. He speaks truth into the heart, even when lies surround it. He affirms worth even when people diminish it. He anchors identity in his love rather than in human approval. This is why many believers rise from adversity with a stronger sense of self than before the attack. What the enemy intended to destroy, God uses to build. The sustaining power of God also manifests through divine companionship. When humans depart, God remains. When friends become enemies, God becomes closer than a friend. When supporters disappear, God becomes the comforter. When the world misunderstands, God understands fully. The believer learns to rely not on human validation, but on divine presence. They discover that God's companionship is not merely theological, but experiential. They sense His nearness in moments when they should have felt alone. They feel His peace in moments when their emotions should have collapsed. They recognize His guidance when their minds were overwhelmed. This companionship becomes a lifeline, connecting the believer to a source of strength beyond human comprehension. Another essential dimension of divine sustenance is that God prepares the believer for restoration, even before restoration arrives. He strengthens the foundation so that when elevation comes, the believer can stand under its weight. Restoration is not merely a return to normalcy, it is an ascent to a higher level of purpose, responsibility, and influence. Without the sustaining power of God shaping the inner life, restoration could become dangerous. Influence without humility leads to pride. Authority without compassion leads to hardness. Elevation without endurance leads to collapse. God sustains the believer so that when He lifts them, they rise with maturity rather than ambition, with wisdom rather than impulsiveness, with gratitude rather than entitlement. Throughout Scripture, divine sustenance precedes divine promotion. Joseph was sustained in prison before becoming ruler in Egypt. Moses was sustained in the desert before becoming the deliverer of Israel. David was sustained in caves before being crowned king. Daniel was sustained in exile before becoming a prophetic voice in the Babylonian Empire. Jesus was sustained during fasting and temptation before beginning His ministry. Sustenance is preparation. It is the divine shaping of a soul called to carry weight beyond human capacity. In Psalm 41, David ultimately becomes a picture of Christ, who also experienced betrayal, suffering, and the hostility of hidden enemies. Jesus was sustained by the Father in every moment of His earthly struggle. He endured loneliness, misunderstanding, rejection, and physical pain, yet the Father upheld Him until the very end. The sustaining power of God did not prevent suffering. It preserved purpose through suffering. The life of Christ reveals the ultimate pattern. God sustains His chosen ones so that their mission may be fulfilled despite opposition. In the lives of believers today, this pattern continues. God sustains because He has assigned purpose. He sustains because He has ordained destiny. He sustains because He sees beyond the present trial. He sustains because the believer's life is intertwined with His plan. Sustenance is not random. It is intentional. It is God's declaration that He has not finished His work in the believer's life. The soul that has been sustained by God emerges from adversity with a testimony that carries authority. Others may have survived battles, but few have been sustained by God in battles designed to break them. When such a believer speaks, their words carry weight. When they pray, their prayers carry power. When they lead, they carry compassion. When they testify, they carry authenticity. Their life becomes evidence of God's sustaining presence. The sustaining power of God is also a promise for the future. The believer who has been sustained once will be sustained again. God does not abandon the soul He has upheld. He continues to strengthen, guide, protect, and empower. This assurance becomes a source of deep peace. The believer no longer fears the future, for they know they do not walk into it alone. They no longer fear betrayal, for they know God will uphold them again. They no longer fear adversity, for they have experienced the faithfulness of God firsthand. This truth becomes a fortress in the heart. No matter what comes, God will sustain. Please subscribe to the channel to continue receiving deep messages that strengthen your walk with God and reveal His sustaining power in your life. There is a profound moment in every believer's journey when the trials, betrayals, hidden enemies, internal exhaustion, and spiritual warfare converge into a single truth. God himself is the final source of stability, victory, and destiny. All throughout Psalm 41, the shadow of opposition presses in on David, yet the psalm ultimately rises into a declaration that God lifts him up and sets him in his presence forever. This is not simply a poetic sentiment. It is a revelation of the ultimate purpose of every trial the believer endures. Every pain, every wound, every attack, every betrayal, and every moment of inner turmoil funnels into one great spiritual truth. God uses what was meant to break you to establish you in a place of permanence, authority, divine fellowship, and spiritual maturity that nothing and no one can overturn. This final topic is the culmination of everything that preceded it. A deep exploration of what it means to not only survive hidden enemies, but transcend them in the power of God. The spiritual life is filled with paradoxes. The believer is often lifted through being lowered, strengthened through weakness, made wise through suffering, purified through adversity, and elevated through humiliation. The justice of God does not operate according to human logic. It operates according to divine purpose. As David concludes Psalm 41, he moves beyond the personal pain of betrayal and opposition into a revelation of God's eternal faithfulness. The affliction was temporary, but the favor of God is permanent. The suffering was momentary, but the elevation of God endures. The betrayal was painful, but the presence of God is healing. The opposition was fierce, but the protection of God is complete. One of the most transformative truths of the spiritual life is that God uses adversity to prepare the soul for deeper communion with Him. This communion is not merely emotional comfort. It is an anchoring in the presence of God that becomes the defining environment of the believer's life. David declares that God sets him before his face forever. This imagery reveals that stability in God's presence is the ultimate victory, greater than the defeat of enemies, greater than the restoration of reputation, greater than vindication, and greater than elevation. The presence of God is the destination. Everything else is a process leading to this destination. To live in God's presence is to live in truth, strength, clarity, and spiritual authority. Hidden enemies lose power in the presence of God, for they cannot operate in truth. Betrayal loses its sting in the presence of God, for He heals the heart. Human opinion loses influence in the presence of God, for His acceptance is enough. Fear dissolves in the presence of God, for perfect love casts out fear. Confusion dissipates in the presence of God, for His wisdom becomes the guiding light. This is why the enemy's greatest strategy is not simply to attack the believer, but to disconnect the believer from the awareness of God's nearness. If the believer becomes consumed by the noise of enemies, they lose sight of the silence of God's strength. But God never withdraws His presence from those who belong to Him. Even when the believer feels abandoned, God remains. Even when the believer feels weak, God upholds. Even when the believer feels lost, God guides. Even when the believer feels betrayed, God remains faithful. David's declaration of being set before God's face forever is not a poetic exaggeration. It is the spiritual reality of every believer who endures adversity with integrity. God honors those who suffer righteously. He draws near to the wounded. He comforts the betrayed. He strengthens the faint-hearted. And in the end, He establishes them. Establishment is a divine act that goes far beyond temporary restoration. Restoration brings healing and vindication, but establishment brings permanence and authority. Many believers cry out for restoration, but God desires to give establishment. Restoration addresses what was lost. Establishment creates what cannot be lost. When God establishes a believer, he sets them in a position of spiritual strength that does not depend on the opinions of others, the approval of people, or the stability of circumstances. This establishment becomes the foundation on which the believer builds the rest of their life. One of the most extraordinary aspects of divine establishment is that it emerges from seasons of instability. The believer who has been shaken learns to appreciate stability. The believer who has been betrayed learns to value divine loyalty. The believer who has been targeted learns to value divine protection. The believer who has been misunderstood learns to value divine understanding. These experiences shape the heart so deeply that when God establishes them, they carry a maturity and wisdom that cannot be taken away. They become unshakable, not because of a lack of adversity, but because they were sustained in adversity. Spiritual maturity is not measured by knowledge, but by endurance. It is measured by the ability to remain faithful when circumstances contradict the promises of God. It is measured by the ability to trust when every human support collapses. It is measured by the ability to forgive when betrayal strikes deeply. It is measured by the ability to wait when the soul is exhausted. Spiritual maturity is formed in the crucible of suffering, shaped by the presence of God and revealed in the stability of character. David learned this deeply. Before he was lifted into the position of king, he endured years of injustice, betrayal, hostility, and misunderstanding. He was hunted, slandered, abandoned, and betrayed by friends and enemies alike. Yet in every moment, God sustained him. In every season, God refined him. In every circumstance, God prepared him. And when the time of establishment came, David was not merely restored, he was transformed. This pattern repeats in the lives of all who are called by God for spiritual influence. The believer who emerges from adversity with their faith intact becomes a vessel of divine revelation. Their testimony carries weight because it is rooted in experience. They no longer recite theology, they embody it. They no longer merely believe in God's faithfulness, they have lived it. They no longer hope for God's justice, they have witnessed it. Their life becomes a message, written by suffering but illuminated by grace. Others look at them and see the evidence of God's sustaining and restoring power. Hidden enemies, whether human or spiritual, ultimately become instruments of transformation. God does not merely defeat them, he uses them. Their hostility becomes the pressure that strengthens the believer. Their betrayal becomes the fire that purifies the heart. Their accusations become the catalyst that reveals destiny. Their attempts to diminish the believer become the platform through which God lifts them. Every attack becomes fertilizer for spiritual growth. Every wound becomes a doorway to deeper healing. Every loss becomes preparation for divine abundance. This is why Scripture repeatedly proclaims that all things work together for good for those who love God. The believer's affliction becomes the raw material of God's craftsmanship. In the mystery of divine providence, God weaves every thread of adversity into a tapestry of glory. The believer does not see the full picture while enduring trials, but God sees the design. He sees the final outcome long before the believer takes the first step into the valley. He sees the triumph hidden within the struggle. He sees the testimony hidden within the tears. He sees the wisdom hidden within the weakness. He sees the spiritual authority hidden within the pain. Nothing is wasted, nothing is overlooked, nothing is random. Everything has purpose when surrendered to God. This spiritual truth becomes even more profound when the believer realizes that God does not merely react to adversity. He anticipates it. He prepares strength before suffering begins. He assigns angels before enemies arise. He plants seeds of truth before lies are spoken. He builds inner resilience before betrayal occurs. He fortifies identity before attacks target it. He establishes destiny before opposition forms against it. This means that the believer enters every battle already prepared for victory. The enemy may attack, but God equips. The enemy may wound, but God heals. The enemy may oppose, but God elevates. The enemy may divide, but God unites. The enemy may weaken, but God strengthens. In this way, the believer becomes spiritually unbreakable. Not because they avoid adversity, but because adversity cannot destroy what God sustains. The soul becomes anchored. The mind becomes fortified. The heart becomes purified. The spirit becomes sharpened. The believer walks not in fear of opposition, but in confidence of divine companionship. They no longer view hidden enemies as threats, but as confirmation of calling. They no longer see suffering as defeat, but as preparation. What emerges through this process is a believer who knows God intimately, not through theory, but through experience. They know the God who sustains, the God who restores, the God who vindicates, the God who protects, the God who speaks truth, the God who heals, and the God who lifts. Their faith becomes unshakable because it was forged in the furnace of affliction. Their heart becomes compassionate because it was broken and mended by divine hands. Their spirit becomes wise because it was shaped through deep encounters with suffering and deeper encounters with God. Their character becomes strong because it was purified through trials. Their purpose becomes clear because it was revealed through opposition. The final victory described in Psalm 41 is not merely the downfall of enemies, but the transformation of the believer. God does not simply lift them above their enemies, He lifts them beyond the reach of their past selves. The believer becomes someone they could never have become without adversity. They become someone who understands the heart of God more deeply. They become someone who carries spiritual authority that comes only through suffering. They become someone who walks with God in a way that transcends ordinary faith. This transformation produces a new kind of confidence, not arrogance, which depends on self, but divine confidence, which depends wholly on God. This confidence manifests as peace in the midst of uncertainty, clarity in the midst of confusion, strength in the midst of weakness, and hope in the midst of despair. It is the confidence of someone who knows that God has been faithful in the past and will be faithful in the future. It is the confidence of someone who has seen the hand of God move in ways that human logic cannot explain. It is the confidence of someone who has survived what should have destroyed them. When God lifts a believer to this level of spiritual maturity, He entrusts them with assignments that require stability, endurance, compassion, and wisdom. These assignments often involve leadership, influence, healing others, intercession, and carrying spiritual authority in environments of darkness. A believer who has never suffered deeply cannot guide others through suffering. A believer who has never faced betrayal cannot heal those who are broken by betrayal. A believer who has never walked through hidden attacks cannot help others discern and overcome hidden enemies. God transforms the believer not only for their own destiny, but for the destinies of others. In this way, the restoration and elevation described in Psalm 41 are not ends in themselves, they are beginnings. They mark the transition into a new phase of spiritual purpose. The believer rises not merely to enjoy victory, but to fulfill a greater calling. They rise not to boast, but to serve. They rise not to judge, but to heal. They rise not to dominate, but to guide. They rise not because they deserve it, but because God prepared them for it. And when they stand in the place God lifts them to, they stand not alone, but rooted in His presence. This is why the psalm concludes with a declaration of eternal praise. For when the believer has walked through the valley of hidden enemies and emerged into the light of divine presence, gratitude becomes their posture. Worship becomes their lifestyle. Praise becomes their language. They understand that without God they would have fallen. Without God they would have lost themselves. Without God they would have been destroyed. But because of God, they stand. Because of God, they rise. Because of God, they endure. Because of God, they prevail. The believer who reaches this stage becomes a living testimony of Psalm 41. They embody its truth, they demonstrate its power, they reflect its promises, and their life becomes an offering of praise to the God who lifts the afflicted and brings every secret enemy to nothing. Please subscribe to the channel to continue receiving messages that strengthen, uplift, and deepen your walk with God.